Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Spinning Sign, from Jake Morrison. The stretch of Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page has always been my favorite run, especially during those quiet October nights when the desert air carries just enough chill to keep you alert, but not uncomfortable. I've been driving this route for nearly 15 years now, hauling everything from construction equipment to camping supplies, and I know every curve, every pothole, every mile marker like they're old friends. My Peterbilt 379 purrs along these roads like she was born for them, her 18 wheels eating up the asphalt with a steady rhythm that's become the soundtrack to my life. That particular night started like any other. I'd picked up a load of outdoor gear in Phoenix and was making good time toward a sporting goods distributor in Utah. The moon hung fat and silver above the desert, casting everything in that ethereal glow that makes the Southwest feel like another planet entirely. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the road, and the gentle hum of my engine cutting through the crystalline silence. I'd been driving for about 3 hours when I noticed something odd about mile marker 127. It's positioned on a long, straight stretch where the highway cuts through a particularly desolate section of high desert, surrounded by nothing but sagebrush and the occasional Joshua tree, reaching up toward the star-scattered sky. I'd passed this marker thousands of times before, always noting it as my halfway point to a good truck stop about 30 miles ahead, where I usually grabbed coffee and stretched my legs. But tonight, as my headlights swept across the familiar reflective green sign, something seemed different. The marker appeared to be shifting somehow, as if it were slowly turning on its post. I slowed my rig slightly, squinting through the windshield, telling myself it was just a trick of the headlights or maybe some debris caught in a crosswind. Desert winds can be unpredictable, especially at night when the temperature differentials create strange air currents. As I drew closer, however, the movement became more pronounced. The rectangular sign was definitely rotating, making slow, deliberate revolutions around its mounting post like some kind of bizarre roadside pinwheel. The white numerals 27 would face the road for a moment, clearly visible in my headlights, then slowly turn away, showing only the blank metallic back of the sign, before continuing their rotation to face the road again. I pulled my rig to a stop on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking amber against the desert darkness, and sat there for several minutes just watching this impossible sight. The sign continued its steady rotation, neither speeding up nor slowing down, as consistent as clockwork. There was no wind that I could feel, no mechanical apparatus visible, nothing that could explain why a standard highway mile marker would be spinning like a lazy Susan. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. Maybe it was damaged, somehow knocked loose by a vehicle or vandals, and the slight desert breeze was just enough to keep it turning. Maybe there was some kind of magnetic field or underground utility that was affecting the metal. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized and my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew none of these explanations fit what I was seeing. I climbed down from my cab, boots crunching on the gravelly shoulder, and approached the marker for a closer look. The desert night air was cool against my face, carrying the faint scent of sage and that peculiar emptiness that comes with vast, unpopulated spaces. As I got within about 10 feet of the sign, I could hear it moving, a soft grinding sound like metal against metal, punctuated by tiny squeaks that suggested the rotation wasn't entirely smooth. But what unsettled me more than the movement itself was the discovery that the numbers weren't always the same. Sometimes the sign would turn to face me and display 127 as expected, but other times it would show 172 or 217 or even 721. The digits seemed to rearrange themselves with each revolution, as if the sign couldn't make up its mind about which mile of highway it was supposed to mark. I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone, thinking I should document this strangeness, maybe call the state highway department in the morning. But when I looked at the screen, I realized I had no signal whatsoever. That struck me as odd, since I knew this stretch of road usually had decent coverage. The phone showed not even a single bar, just that frustrating no service message, as if some invisible force field were blocking all communication with the outside world. As I stood there in the amber glow of my hazard lights, watching this impossible mile marker spin and change its numbers like some kind of roadside slot machine, I became aware of other sounds in the desert night. There was a low humming, almost below the threshold of hearing, that seemed to be coming from the ground itself. The usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds had gone completely silent, leaving only this strange subsonic vibration and the grinding of the rotating sign. That's when I noticed my truck's engine had changed its tone. The steady diesel rumble that I knew as well as my own heartbeat had developed an odd harmonic, a resonance that seemed to sync with the humming from the ground. My hazard lights, which should have been blinking in a regular pattern, had begun to pulse in time with the rotation of the mile marker, as if my entire rig was somehow being influenced by whatever force was affecting the sign. I hurried back toward my cab, suddenly feeling very exposed and alone in that vast stretch of desert. But as I reached for the door handle, I realized that my truck had moved. Not dramatically, but enough that I was certain it wasn't parked in quite the same position where I'd left it. The Peterbilt now sat at a slightly different angle, as if it had rotated a few degrees clockwise while I'd been examining the mile marker. Climbing back into the driver's seat, I noticed that my GPS display was showing conflicting information. The screen flickered between different mile readings, jumping from 127 to 172 to 217, matching the numbers I'd seen on the spinning sign. My odometer was doing something similar, the digits rolling forward and backward seemingly at random, as if the truck couldn't determine how far it had actually traveled. I tried to radio for help, but the CB was picking up nothing but static, punctuated by strange, rhythmic pulses that matched the rotation of the mile marker. Even the emergency channels were filled with the same pulsing interference, as if something were jamming all radio frequencies in the immediate area. The smart thing would have been to turn around, head back to Flagstaff, and report this to the authorities. But truck drivers are stubborn by nature, and 15 years on the road had taught me that schedules matter more than mysteries. I convinced myself that whatever was happening was localized to this 1 mile marker, that I could simply drive past it and everything would return to normal. I put the Peterbilt in gear and began to accelerate, watching in my mirrors as the spinning mile marker receded into the darkness behind me. For a few minutes, everything seemed to settle back to normal. The engine resumed its familiar rhythm, the GPS stabilized, and the CB static faded back to the usual background chatter of distant truckers. But then I saw the next mile marker ahead, and my blood went cold. Mile marker 128 was spinning too, its numbers cycling through the same impossible permutations. And beyond that, barely visible in the reach of my headlights, I could make out the pale green glow of mile marker 129, also rotating slowly in the desert night. I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever influence was affecting the highway markers, but each sign I passed was caught in the same mysterious rotation. Mile 130, 131, 132, all spinning like prayer wheels, their numbers shifting and changing as if the very concept of distance and location had become fluid. Worse still, I began to notice that I wasn't making forward progress the way I should have been. Despite maintaining highway speed for what felt like 20 minutes, my GPS showed that I'd only advanced a few miles. Time itself seemed to be stretching and distorting, minutes feeling like hours while miles compressed into yards. The desert landscape began to repeat itself in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I passed the same distinctive rock formation 3 times, saw the same dead tree silhouetted against the moon over and over again, as if I were caught in some kind of loop. My fuel gauge, which should have been dropping steadily, remained stubbornly static, neither increasing nor decreasing despite the continued running of my engine. Panic started to creep in around the edges of my consciousness. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange encounters on lonely highways, tales dismissed as road-weary hallucinations or too much coffee and not enough sleep. But this felt undeniably real. From the grinding sound of the rotating markers to the way my steering wheel vibrated in harmony with their movement. Just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd be trapped forever on this impossible stretch of highway, doomed to pass spinning mile markers until my diesel ran dry or my sanity snapped completely, I saw something different ahead. When you blink, the world stops. From Marcus Delacroix. The cab of my Peterbilt 379 had become my sanctuary over 15 years on the road, its diesel engine humming a familiar lullaby as I pushed through the Arkansas countryside on a November night that felt more like January. The heater struggled against an unseasonable cold that seemed to seep through every seal and crack, turning my breath into pale wisps that danced in the green glow of the dashboard lights. Rain drummed against the windshield in a steady rhythm that should have been comforting. But something about this particular storm felt different. Wrong somehow, like nature itself was holding its breath. I'd been driving the I-40 corridor for more years than I cared to count, hauling everything from electronics to livestock feed across the heartland, but I'd never experienced weather quite like this. The rain fell in perfectly straight lines, each droplet catching the headlights of my truck like tiny prisms before striking the glass with an almost musical precision. My wipers swept across the windshield in their eternal dance, clearing the water only for it to return instantly, creating an hypnotic pattern that made my eyelids feel heavy despite the 3 cups of truck stop coffee churning in my stomach. The CB radio crackled with scattered chatter from other drivers, their voices distorted by static and distance. Most were complaining about the sudden weather change, how the temperature had dropped nearly 40 degrees in the span of 2 hours, turning what should have been a mild autumn evening into something that belonged in the depths of winter. I reached for the radio to add my own observations to the conversation, but hesitated when I noticed something peculiar about the rain on my windshield. During the brief moments when I blinked, really blinked with intention rather than the unconscious flutter that keeps our eyes moist, the raindrops seemed to pause in their descent, not slow down, not change direction, but actually freeze in place for the split second my eyes were closed. At first I attributed it to fatigue, the kind of visual tricks that long-haul drivers know all too well. The mind plays games when you've been staring at the same stretch of asphalt for hours, creating phantom animals in your peripheral vision, or making distant taillights seem to dance and weave when they're actually traveling in perfect straight lines. But the phenomenon persisted, becoming more pronounced with each deliberate blink. The raindrops would suspend themselves in midair like tiny crystal beads on invisible string, their perfect spherical forms catching and holding the light from my headlamps before resuming their earthward journey. The moment my eyes reopened, I found myself blinking more frequently, testing this impossible occurrence, watching as the entire curtain of precipitation would pause in its descent, as if responding to some cosmic remote control that I operated unconsciously. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, its surface slick with the accumulated rainfall that reflected my truck's amber running lights in long, wavering streaks. Mile markers passed in a steady countdown toward my destination in Memphis, but I found my attention increasingly drawn to the strange behavior of the storm. Other vehicles were few and far between at this hour, just the occasional pair of headlights approaching from the opposite direction, or the distant red glow of taillights ahead, all of us moving through this peculiar weather like ships in a crystalline sea. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, running through every possible explanation my tired mind could conjure. Perhaps it was a trick of the windshield glass, some distortion caused by temperature differential between the heated cab and the frigid air outside. Maybe the wipers were creating some kind of optical illusion, their rubber blades leaving microscopic films of water that refracted light in unusual ways. But deep down, in that instinctive part of the brain that has kept truck drivers alive through decades of dangerous hauls, I knew I was witnessing something that defied rational explanation. The radio suddenly erupted with excited chatter, a voice I didn't recognize cutting through the static with barely contained panic. Anyone else seeing this rain doing funny things? I swear it's moving sideways when I'm not looking straight at it. Another driver responded immediately, his tone equally unsettled. Roger that, eastbound. I thought I was losing my mind. This whole storm's got me spooked. A third voice joined the conversation, older and calmer, but with an undercurrent of concern that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Been driving for 30 years, boys, and I've never seen weather patterns like this. Rain don't behave the way it's supposed to tonight. I reached for the CB handset, intending to share my own observations about the blinking phenomenon, when I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. In the distance ahead, perhaps a mile or two down the highway, I could see the taillights of another truck, their red glow steady and reassuring in the strange night. But when I blinked, deliberately and slowly, those lights didn't just remain stationary like the rain. They moved backward, as if the truck itself was traveling in reverse for the duration of my blink, only to resume its forward progress when my eyes reopened. The implications of this discovery sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the unseasonable cold. If the rain was freezing when I blinked and now other moving objects were affected as well, what else might be subject to this temporal distortion? I experimented cautiously, watching my speedometer as I closed my eyes for longer periods. The needle remained steady at 65 miles per hour, but something felt different about the truck's motion, as if we were suspended in amber during those moments of artificial darkness. My cargo load of automotive parts shifted slightly in the trailer behind me, the familiar creaking and settling sounds that every driver learns to interpret like a sailor reading the wind. But tonight, these sounds came at wrong intervals, occurring during my blinks rather than during the normal sway and bounce of highway travel. It was as if the entire world was operating on a different temporal frequency, one that synced with the opening and closing of my eyes in ways that violated every law of physics I'd ever learned. The truck ahead of me began to signal for an exit, its amber turn indicator flashing in the darkness like a lighthouse beacon. I watched as it gradually moved toward the right lane, preparing to leave the highway for whatever rest stop or fuel plaza awaited in the darkness beyond my headlight range. But when I blinked, the truck wasn't just motionless. It was fading, becoming translucent like morning mist, its solid form dissolving into something that looked more like a memory than a physical object. Heart rate increased as the implications of this observation settled into my consciousness like stones dropping into still water. If other vehicles were becoming insubstantial during my blinks, what did that mean for my own truck? Was I experiencing some kind of temporal displacement? Or was the entire world around me shifting between states of reality based on my perception? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them, each more unsettling than the last. The CB radio crackled again, but this time the voices seemed distant and hollow, as if they were traveling across vast expanses of time, rather than the relatively short distances between trucks on the same highway. Anyone else having trouble with their instruments? My GPS keeps showing locations I passed an hour ago. The response came through waves of static that sounded almost like whispers. Radio's been acting up too. Keep hearing conversations that don't make sense, like people talking about roads that don't exist. I realized with growing unease that my own radio was picking up these phantom transmissions, voices that seemed to be coming from drivers in different times or places, their words overlapping and interweaving into a tapestry of confusion that made less sense the more I tried to understand it. Some spoke about summer heat while driving through snowstorms. Others described bright sunshine while clearly traveling through the same darkness that surrounded me. The rain continued its impossible behavior, freezing and resuming with each blink like a cosmic slideshow controlled by my eyelids. But now I noticed that the patterns were changing, becoming more complex and intentional. During longer blinks, the suspended raindrops would rearrange themselves into formations that resembled letters or symbols, messages written in water and light that dissolved the moment my eyes reopened. I tried to decipher these cryptic communications, but they faded too quickly, leaving only the impression of meaning without substance. A new voice came through the radio, clearer than the others, but speaking words that made my blood run cold. The rain remembers everything, driver. Every journey, every mile, every moment of doubt. When you close your eyes, you're reading the history of the road. The transmission ended in static before I could respond, leaving me alone with questions that seemed to multiply like the raindrops on my windshield. I began to understand that I was caught in something far beyond a simple weather anomaly. The rain, the temporal distortions, the phantom radio transmissions, all of it pointed toward a reality where the boundary between past, present, and future had become as permeable as the membrane of a soap bubble, the truck that breathes in. From Marcus, the first time I noticed it, I thought maybe I was just tired. 3 days into a cross-country haul from Portland to Miami, and the Florida heat was getting to me even with the AC running full blast. But there it was again, that strange rhythm coming from somewhere deep in the cab of my Peterbilt, like the truck was breathing, not the regular diesel rumble I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of driving, but something else entirely, something that rose and fell with an almost organic cadence, as if the 18-wheeler had developed lungs. I'd picked up this particular rig from a dealer in Tacoma just 2 weeks prior. My old Kenworth had finally given up the ghost outside Bakersfield, leaving me stranded with a load of refrigerated goods and a deadline that wouldn't wait. The dealer, a weathered man named Hutchins with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails, had seemed eager to move this particular truck. Too eager, maybe. The price was right, though, and the engine sounded strong during the test drive. The paperwork showed it had belonged to a driver named Coleman, who'd apparently just stopped showing up to work one day, leaving the truck sitting in a lot in Jacksonville for 3 months before it was repossessed. Now, rolling south through the Georgia pines with Spanish moss hanging like funeral shrouds from the branches, I was beginning to wonder if I'd made a mistake. The breathing sound had grown more pronounced over the past 100 miles, synchronized with something I couldn't quite identify. At first I'd assumed it was the air brake system cycling, but the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. It happened every 12 seconds like clockwork. A deep inhalation that seemed to come from the dashboard, the seats, maybe even the sleeper berth behind me. The radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, their voices mixing with the static of a thunderstorm building somewhere to the east. Lightning flickered in my mirrors, still distant but moving closer. The weather service had been warning about severe storms all afternoon, and I could smell rain in the air even with the windows sealed tight. That metallic scent that comes before a downpour mixed with something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a funeral home. I pulled into a truck stop outside Valdosta as the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the windshield. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few other rigs scattered across the asphalt like sleeping giants. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting an unsteady glow that made everything look sickly and pale. As I climbed down from the cab, I noticed how quiet it was. Even the usual truck stop sounds seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing the noise. Inside the diner, I nursed a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Carter administration, and tried to shake the uneasiness that had been building in my chest. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with graying hair, refilled my cup without being asked. "That your Peterbilt out there?" she asked, nodding toward the window. "The blue one?" "Yeah, why?" She hesitated, wiping the counter with a dish rag that had seen better days. "Had another driver in here a few months back with a truck just like it. Blue Peterbilt with those same chrome stacks. Strange fellow. Kept talking about how his truck was somehow different, but he couldn't explain how. Said it felt like it was watching him." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth. "What happened to him?" "Don't rightly know. One morning his truck was gone, but nobody saw him leave. Manager found his wallet and keys sitting on this very counter. License, credit cards, everything still in it. Police figured he just walked away from his problems, you know how it is. But his wife came by a week later, crying her eyes out. Said he'd never leave his truck behind, not willingly. I paid for the coffee and walked back out into the parking lot, where the storm was beginning to assert itself with real authority. Rain drummed against the asphalt in sheets, and the wind had picked up enough to set the power lines singing overhead. As I approached my truck, I noticed something that made me stop short. The engine was off, had been off for the better part of an hour, but I could swear I saw the chrome exhaust stacks moving slightly, as if something was flowing through them. Not the usual heat shimmer from a hot engine, but a rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched the breathing sound I'd been hearing. I climbed back into the cab and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain hammer the roof and watching the lightning grow closer. The breathing was more pronounced now, unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once: the dashboard, the doors, the ceiling of the sleeper cab. Even the steering wheel felt warm beneath my hands, not with the warmth of machinery, but something more organic, more alive. The radio crackled to life unexpectedly, though I hadn't turned it on. Static filled the cab, punctuated by fragments of voices that seemed to come from very far away. I reached for the dial, but before I could turn it off, the static cleared and I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice, but different somehow, hollow and echoing as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. "Can't stop driving," my voice said through the speakers. "It needs to move. Needs to breathe in the miles, breathe in the road. Every mile makes it stronger." I twisted the radio dial hard to the left, shutting it off completely, but the voice continued. "You feel it now, don't you, Marcus? The way it pulls at you. The way it makes you want to keep driving even when you're bone-tired. The way it drinks in the diesel and the miles and the hours until there's nothing left of you but the need to move." The truck shuddered around me, not with the familiar vibration of an engine turning over, but with something that felt disturbingly like a deep breath. The dashboard lights flickered on without my touching the ignition, and I could feel the massive vehicle coming to life beneath me. The air brakes released with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh of satisfaction. "Start her up, Marcus." The voice that was my voice continued. "You know you want to. Feel how she wants to run, wants to breathe in the highway and the night and the storm. Every mile fed to her makes her stronger, and every driver who gives himself to the road becomes part of her." My hand moved toward the ignition key almost without conscious thought. The truck around me felt warm and welcoming, like coming home after a long, cold journey. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside the cab I felt protected, embraced. The breathing sound had become a lullaby, rhythmic and comforting. All I had to do was turn the key, put her in gear, and let the truck take me wherever it wanted to go. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but they seemed distant and unimportant compared to the growing need to drive, to feed the truck miles and motion in the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched across the continent. I understood now what had happened to Coleman, why his wallet and keys had been left behind. The truck hadn't stolen his body. It had absorbed his will, his purpose, his very identity, leaving only the shell of a man who no longer knew who he was without the highway beneath his wheels. With tremendous effort, I jerked my hand away from the ignition and threw open the driver's door. Rain lashed at me instantly, cold and sharp as needles, but it helped clear my head. I stumbled out of the cab and ran for the diner, not looking back even when I heard what sounded like a frustrated growl from the truck behind me. Inside, I called my dispatcher and told him I was done, that he needed to send someone else to pick up the load. I didn't care about the penalties or the lost income. I bought a bus ticket to the nearest city and took a cab to the station, leaving the keys to the Peterbilt on the diner counter just as Coleman must have done months before. But even now, 3 states away and working a desk job that pays half what I made on the road, I still hear it sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn. That rhythmic breathing, patient and persistent, calling me back to the highway. And I know that somewhere out there, a blue Peterbilt with chrome stacks is still rolling through the night, still breathing in the miles and waiting for another driver to feed its endless hunger for the open road. When I met myself on Route 84, from Jake Morrison. The stretch of Route 84 between Portland and Salt Lake City has always been my favorite run, especially during those quiet hours when the world feels suspended between day and night. I've been hauling freight for 17 years now, and there's something about the way the mountains rise up around you in the distance, their peaks catching the last whispers of sunset, that makes even the loneliest miles feel like home. My Peterbilt 379 purrs beneath me like a contented cat, her chrome stacks gleaming under the amber glow of the dashboard lights, and the steady rhythm of her engine has become as familiar as my own heartbeat. That particular evening in late October, I was carrying a load of electronics from a warehouse in Oregon, bound for a distribution center in Utah. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that makes you grateful for the warmth of the cab, and my CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other drivers sharing road conditions and weather updates. The forecast had mentioned possible scattered showers, but the sky remained clear, painted in those deep purples and oranges that only seem to exist in the American West. I'd pulled into the Sunset Truck Plaza around 9:30, a decent-sized stop with the usual amenities, bright fluorescent lights casting everything in that familiar truck stop glow. The place wasn't particularly busy, maybe a dozen rigs scattered across the lot, their running lights twinkling like earthbound stars. I needed fuel and a quick bite before pushing through the night stretch toward Idaho, where I planned to catch a few hours of sleep at a rest area I'd used many times before. After topping off my tanks and grabbing a coffee and sandwich from inside, I was walking back toward my truck when I noticed another Peterbilt parked about 6 spaces down from mine. Same model, same year from the look of it, even the same deep blue paint job with chrome accents. The sight made me chuckle, because it's not every day you see such an identical rig, especially one that's clearly been maintained with the same kind of care I put into my own equipment. The chrome gleamed without a spot of road grime, and the paint looked fresh enough to reflect the parking lot lights like a dark mirror. As I approached my truck, movement in the other Peterbilt's cab caught my eye. The driver was settling in behind the wheel, adjusting his mirrors and preparing to pull out. In the brief moment when the interior light was on, I caught a glimpse of him through the windshield, and something about his profile looked oddly familiar. The way he tilted his head, the gesture he made while checking his logbook, even the baseball cap he wore all seemed strangely recognizable, like watching an old home movie of yourself that you'd forgotten was ever filmed. I climbed into my own cab, started her up and pulled out of the truck stop, following the familiar routine of merging back onto the interstate. The other Peterbilt had pulled out just ahead of me, and as we both accelerated up the on-ramp, I found myself naturally falling into formation behind him. His driving style was remarkably similar to my own. The same smooth shifts, the same careful spacing, the same courteous use of signals that comes from years of professional experience on the road. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena, the kind of programming that seems perfectly suited to the mysterious hours between midnight and dawn. Outside, the landscape rolled past in gentle waves of darkness, punctuated by the occasional cluster of small-town lights. The other truck maintained a steady pace about a quarter-mile ahead of me, his taillights providing a comforting point of reference in the vast emptiness of the highway. Around midnight, we approached a rest area that I knew well, a quiet spot with picnic tables and a scenic overlook where you could see the valley spread out below during daylight hours. I watched the Peterbilt ahead signal and take the exit, and since I'd been planning to stop there anyway for a short break, I followed. The rest area was empty except for us, and he parked in the same spot I usually preferred, near the far end where the view was best, and the highway noise was somewhat muffled by a stand of pine trees. I parked a few spaces away and sat in my cab for a moment, finishing the last of my coffee and updating my logbook. Through my passenger window, I could see the other driver doing the same thing, his interior light creating a warm glow inside his cab. When he stepped down to stretch his legs and walk around his truck, I got my first clear look at him, and the sight sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October night air. The man walking around that identical Peterbilt was me. Not someone who looked like me, not a distant relative or doppelganger, but literally me in every detail I could make out. The same height and build, the same way of walking, the same unconscious habit of adjusting his cap and checking the straps on his load. Even in the dim lighting of the rest area, there was no mistaking what I was seeing. Though my mind struggled to process the impossibility of it, I sat frozen in my seat, watching my own movements replicated perfectly by this other version of myself. He completed his walk-around inspection with the same thoroughness I always used, checking tires and lights and load securement with practiced efficiency. When he glanced in my direction, I instinctively ducked down, though I wasn't sure why. A cold sweat had broken out across my forehead, and my hands were trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the distant sound of the other truck starting up and pulling away. I waited several more minutes before sitting up and looking around the rest area, confirming that I was now alone. My reflection stared back at me from the passenger window, familiar and reassuring in its ordinariness, but the memory of what I'd just witnessed made even my own face seem somehow foreign and unsettling. I found myself back on the highway, driving through the night with a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The radio had switched to some ambient music program, soft synthesizers and distant vocals that seemed to drift in and out like fog. Every set of taillights ahead of me made my pulse quicken. Every truck that passed going the other direction made me wonder if I would glimpse my own face in the cab. About an hour later, I saw the familiar blue Peterbilt again, parked at a way station that was closed for the night. As I approached, the truck pulled out and fell in behind me, matching my speed perfectly. In my mirrors, I could see the driver silhouetted in his cab, and though I couldn't make out details, every instinct told me he was watching me with the same intensity that I was watching him. We drove like that for miles, two identical trucks on an empty highway, connected by something I couldn't begin to understand. When I signaled to exit at a truck stop I'd never used before, hoping to break whatever strange pattern we'd fallen into, the other Peterbilt signaled as well. When I changed my mind and stayed on the highway, so did he. It became clear that whatever this was, wherever this other version of myself had come from, I wasn't going to escape it simply by changing my route. The fuel gauge was getting low, forcing me to stop whether I wanted to or not. I pulled into a 24-hour truck stop, hoping the bright lights and activity would somehow break the spell of whatever was happening. The other Peterbilt followed me in and parked directly across from me, our trucks facing each other like mirror images. Through both windshields, I could see my doppelganger sitting in his cab, and I knew he was looking back at me with equal fascination and dread. I forced myself to get out and fuel up, moving through the familiar motions while staying hyper-aware of every sound and movement around me. When I looked up from the fuel pump, the other driver was standing at his own pump, moving in perfect synchronization with me. The same gestures, the same timing, the same unconscious habits I'd never thought about until I saw them reflected back at me. Our eyes met across the space between the trucks, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, I stared into my own face wearing an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of longing and warning that sent ice through my veins. Then he shook his head slowly and pointed down the road, toward the darkness where the highway continued west, before climbing back into his cab and driving away. I haven't seen him again, though I've driven that same route many times since. But sometimes in my mirrors during the deepest hours of night, I catch glimpses of familiar taillights that disappear when I look directly at them. And sometimes, when I stop at that rest area where I first saw him clearly, I find recent tire tracks that match my own Peterbilt exactly, though no other truck has been there. The exit that burns in memory. From Marcus, the thing about driving long haul is that every exit starts to look the same after a while. Just another number on a green sign promising gas stations and fast food chains that blur together in an endless parade of fluorescent sameness. But some exits, well, Some exits brand themselves into your memory whether you want them there or not. Exit 247 off Interstate 80 in Nebraska is one of those exits, and even now, 3 months later, I can still smell the smoke when I close my eyes. It was pushing midnight on a Tuesday in October, one of those crisp autumn nights when the air carries a hint of winter's promise and the stars seem close enough to touch through your windshield. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, running a day behind schedule thanks to a breakdown outside Reno that cost me the better part of an afternoon. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along smooth as butter now, though, her Caterpillar engine purring with that deep rhythmic thrum that becomes like a lullaby after you've been on the road long enough. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other night owls pushing through the darkness, their voices mixing with the steady whisper of wind rushing past my windows. I'd been fighting heavy eyelids for the past hour, and my logbook told me I was cutting it close on my hours of service. The smart thing would have been to pull into the next truck stop and grab some mandatory rest. But the dispatcher had been writing me hard about the delivery schedule, and I figured I could push through until morning if I kept the coffee flowing and the radio loud. Sometimes the smart thing and the thing you actually do are two different animals entirely. That's when I noticed the smell. It started as just a whisper in my nostrils, so faint I almost convinced myself it was imagination. Wood smoke, maybe a fireplace somewhere in the distance, though we were miles from any houses out here in the empty stretch between North Platte and Grand Island. The smell grew stronger as I drove, not gradually like smoke drifting on the wind, but steadily, purposefully, as if something was drawing it directly into my cab. I checked my gauges, thinking maybe something was overheating, but everything looked normal. Engine temp was right where it should be, oil pressure steady, all the warning lights dark and silent, but that smoke smell kept getting stronger. I rolled down my window, thinking maybe some fresh air would clear it out. But the October night that rushed in was clean and cold, carrying nothing but the scent of prairie grass and distant rain. Yet inside my cab, that acrid wood smoke continued to build, thick enough now that I found myself checking the mirrors for some sign of fire, some explanation for what I was breathing. The road behind me stretched empty and dark, lit only by the red glow of my taillights disappearing into the Nebraska night. That's when I saw the sign for exit 247. It appeared in my headlight beams like something materializing from the darkness itself. That familiar green rectangle reflecting my truck's LED arrays with unusual brightness. But there was something wrong with it. Something that made me ease off the accelerator and lean forward against the steering wheel. The sign looked old. Older than it should have for this section of interstate that I knew had been rebuilt within the last decade. The paint was faded and weathered, with scorch marks along the edges that looked like fingers of soot reaching across the metal surface. The smell of smoke was overwhelming now, so thick I could taste it on my tongue, and I found myself signaling for the exit without really deciding to do so. Maybe it was the fatigue talking, or maybe something deeper was pulling me toward that off-ramp, but my hands seemed to move of their own accord, guiding 18 wheels of truck and trailer onto the narrow strip of asphalt that curved away from the main highway. The exit ramp was longer than it should have been, winding in a lazy spiral that seemed to descend far more than the gentle grade of the surrounding landscape warranted. My headlights swept across empty fields on either side, but the darkness beyond their reach felt different somehow, thicker and more complete than ordinary night shadow. The cab of my truck had grown quiet, too quiet, as if the steady background hum of the engine and the whisper of air through the vents had been muffled by something I couldn't see. At the bottom of the ramp, instead of the usual collection of gas stations and restaurants, I found a single building squatting beside the road like something left over from a different era. It was a truck stop, but not like any I'd seen in my 15 years of driving. The structure looked like it had been built in the 1950s and left to weather every storm since then, its neon signs flickering with an irregular rhythm that cast dancing shadows across the cracked parking lot. The smell of wood smoke was so intense now that my eyes were watering, and I could see wisps of it drifting through my headlight beams like ghostly fingers beckoning me forward. I pulled into the lot, The crunch of gravel under my tires unnaturally loud in the stillness and shut down the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the distant flutter of those dying neon signs. Through my windshield, I could see other trucks scattered around the lot. Their chrome dulled and their paint faded as if they'd been sitting here far longer than any driver's logbook would allow. Some looked like models I hadn't seen on the road in years, their designs speaking of decades past when trucking was a different kind of profession entirely. I climbed down from my cab, my boots hitting the gravel with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have in the empty air. The smell of smoke was everywhere now. Not just wood, but something else mixed in. Something that reminded me of burning paper and melting plastic and things that shouldn't burn but were burning anyway. The air itself felt thick and warm despite the October chill, as if I were standing near an invisible bonfire that threw no light but plenty of heat. The truck stop's main building hunched before me, its windows glowing with that same sickly yellow light as the flickering neon. Through the glass I could see movement inside, shadowy figures that might have been other drivers getting coffee or checking maps, but their movements seemed too slow, too deliberate, like people moving underwater or in a dream. A bell above the door chimed as I pushed inside, its tone deeper and more resonant than any door chime had a right to be. Inside, the truck stop looked like a museum exhibit of roadside America, complete with a lunch counter lined with red vinyl stools and displays of road atlases that showed highways I didn't recognize. The smell of smoke was even stronger here, mixed now with the scent of coffee that had been brewing far too long, and food that had been sitting under heat lamps until it became something else entirely. The other customers, the figures I'd glimpsed through the windows, turned to look at me as I entered, and I saw that their faces were smudged with soot, their eyes reflecting the yellow light like the eyes of nocturnal animals caught in headlight beams. Behind the counter, a woman in a faded uniform smiled at me with teeth that seemed too white against her smoke-darkened skin. "Welcome to the 247, honey," she said, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't place and a warmth that felt wrong in this place that smelled of burning. "You look like you could use some coffee and a place to rest. We've got everything a driver needs and some things you didn't know you were looking for." I wanted to turn around and walk back to my truck, to fire up the engine and get back on the interstate where the air was clean and the exits made sense, but my feet seemed rooted to the worn linoleum floor. The other customers had gone back to their coffee and their quiet conversations, but I could feel their attention on me like heat from a flame. Through the windows I could see more trucks pulling into the lot, their drivers climbing down with the same slow, dreamlike movements, their faces already showing the first traces of soot. "What is this place?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded strange in the thick air, muffled and distant like words spoken through water. The woman's smile widened, and now I could see that her teeth weren't white at all, but the color of ash from a fire that had burned too long and too hot. "This is where drivers come when they need to rest," she said, pouring coffee from a pot that steamed with something that wasn't quite steam. "This is where the road ends and the real journey begins. Don't you smell it, honey? Don't you smell home?" The smell of smoke was everything now, filling my lungs and seeping into my clothes and skin, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from outside at all. It was coming from inside, from the very air I was breathing, from the building itself and everyone in it. This wasn't a truck stop, it was something else wearing the shape of a truck stop, and every driver who pulled off at exit 247 was adding fuel to whatever fire. The route paved with glass from Marcus Delacroix. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my CB radio like autumn leaves underfoot, informing me about a detour that would save me 3 hours on my run from Bakersfield to Phoenix. Highway 247 was closed due to a jackknifed semi, and I'd need to take what the locals called the Glass Road, a stretch of forgotten asphalt that cut through the Mojave's loneliest corners. I'd been driving these desert routes for 17 years, hauling everything from produce to manufactured goods in my trusty Kenworth, and I thought I knew every mile of blacktop between California and Arizona. But this glass road was new to me. marked on my GPS as a thin gray line threading through absolutely nothing. The turnoff appeared just as the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. A weathered sign, peppered with bullet holes and obscured by sand, simply read State Route 149. Next service is 180 miles. The transition from the main highway to this forgotten stretch was jarring, like stepping from a well-lit room into a dim corridor. The road surface itself seemed different somehow, smoother than it should have been for such a remote stretch, with an almost mirror-like quality that reflected the dying light in strange, prismatic patterns. My 18-wheeler settled into an easy rhythm as I guided her down the empty road, the familiar rumble of the diesel engine providing its usual comfort. The speedometer held steady at 65, and I found myself oddly grateful for the solitude after hours of dodging weekend traffic and aggressive drivers. Out here, with nothing but sagebrush and distant mesas for company, I could think clearly, plan my next run, maybe even catch up on some of the podcasts I'd been meaning to download. The CB radio had fallen silent miles ago, picking up nothing but the occasional burst of static that seemed to echo strangely in the cab. It was nearly full dark when I first noticed the peculiar quality of my headlights against the road surface. The twin beams seemed to fracture and scatter in ways that didn't quite make sense, creating rainbow patterns that danced at the edges of my vision. I initially attributed this to fatigue, the kind of optical tricks that long-haul drivers learn to recognize and compensate for. But as I continued deeper into the desert, the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. The road ahead shimmered and sparkled as if embedded with countless tiny mirrors, each one catching and reflecting my headlights in different directions. I reached for my thermos of coffee, now lukewarm but still caffeinated, and took a long sip while keeping my eyes on the strange road ahead. The taste seemed muted somehow, as if the very air in the cab had grown thinner. Though my altimeter showed no significant change in elevation, the radio produced nothing but low, consistent static now, a white noise that gradually began to take on an almost rhythmic quality, like breathing or the sound of waves against a distant shore. Something about it made me uneasy, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The first pile of debris appeared in my headlight beams about 90 miles into the detour. A glittering mound of what looked like broken glass swept to the road's shoulder. I slowed the truck to get a better look, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just glass, it was automotive glass. Windshields and side windows and rear windows, all shattered into the peculiar cubed fragments that safety glass creates when it breaks. The pile was massive, reaching nearly as high as my cab, and it stretched along the roadside for what must have been 50 yards or more. As I crept past this unsettling monument, my headlights revealed more piles ahead, scattered at irregular intervals like the remnants of some impossible traffic accident. But there were no vehicles anywhere. No twisted metal or burned rubber or any of the other debris you'd expect to find alongside broken automotive glass. Just these pristine mounds of shattered windows, glowing like crushed diamonds in my lights, accompanied by nothing but the endless whisper of wind across the desert and that strange rhythmic static from my radio. I tried to raise someone, anyone on the CB, cycling through channels and calling out with increasing urgency. Breaker 19, this is Kenworth running eastbound on Route 149, anybody copy? Nothing but that breathing static answered me, rising and falling with a cadence that seemed almost organic, almost alive. The temperature gauge on my dashboard showed normal readings, but I found myself shivering despite the cab's warmth, pulling my jacket tighter as I navigated between the growing fields of broken glass. The road itself began to change around mile marker 120. Assuming I could trust the few remaining markers that hadn't been sandblasted into illegibility, the surface became rougher, more textured, and I realized with growing horror that the texture wasn't from normal road wear or desert sand. It was from glass. Thousands upon thousands of tiny fragments embedded directly into the asphalt, creating a surface that sparkled and crunched beneath my tires with every revolution. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A continuous crystalline grinding that seemed to penetrate right through the truck's frame and into my bones. My speed dropped to 40, then 30, then 25 as the glass became denser, the crunching louder, the prismatic reflections more intense. The headlights no longer illuminated the road ahead so much as shattered against it, creating a kaleidoscope of fractured light that made it nearly impossible to judge distance or depth. I found myself gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, leaning forward in my seat to peer through the bewildering display of reflected radiance, praying that no other vehicles would appear in this maze of broken light. That's when I saw the windshield. It was standing upright in the middle of the road like a translucent monument, completely intact despite being surrounded by acres of shattered glass. As my truck approached, I could see that it wasn't just any windshield. It was the windshield from a Kenworth, identical to my own rig, complete with the distinctive curved shape and the small chip in the lower right corner that I'd been meaning to have repaired for months. But that was impossible because I was looking at it through my own windshield. The one with the identical chip, the one that couldn't possibly be standing in the road ahead of me. I stopped the truck completely, engine idling roughly in the thin air while I tried to process what I was seeing. The intact windshield stood perhaps 30 feet ahead, and as I watched, another appeared behind it and another behind that. A procession of ghostly glass barriers stretching into the darkness. Each one was identical. Each one bore the same small chip. Each one reflected my headlights back at me with increasing intensity, until the road ahead became a tunnel of blazing, fractured light. The radio static suddenly resolved into something that might have been voices, distant and distorted but unmistakably human, saying words I couldn't quite make out but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. The sound seemed to come from outside the cab as much as from the radio itself, as if the desert were speaking through the night air, using the countless fragments of broken glass as some vast, crystalline vocal cord. I threw the truck into reverse, but the grinding of glass beneath my tires had become deafening, a sound like the earth itself screaming. In my mirrors, I could see the road behind me had changed as well, now filled with the same impossible procession of intact windshields, trapping me in a corridor of reflected light and grinding glass. The CB radio voices grew louder, more insistent, and I began to make out individual words buried in the static. Turn around, and it'll go back, and the road remembers. With nowhere else to go, I shifted into first gear and began moving forward again, keeping my speed as low as possible while navigating between the standing windshields. Each one I passed shattered the instant my truck drew alongside it, exploding into countless fragments that rained down on my cab like a hailstorm of crystal. The sound was overwhelming, a continuous percussion of breaking glass mixed with the crunch of fragments beneath my wheels and the increasingly urgent voices pouring from the radio. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ordeal ended. The last windshield exploded into glittering dust. The road surface returned to normal asphalt, and my headlights once again illuminated empty desert highway stretching toward distant mountains. The radio fell silent except for the normal background static of an unused channel, and the familiar hum of my engine resumed its comforting rhythm. I checked my GPS and found that I was somehow only 20 miles from the main highway, despite having traveled what felt like hundreds of miles through that crystalline nightmare. I reached the intersection with Highway 85 just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and I pulled into the first truck stop I found to check my rig for damage. The tires showed no signs of running over broken glass. The windshield bore no new chips or cracks, and everything appeared to be in perfect working order. The voice between stations, from Marcus Cole. The stretch of Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque has always been my favorite part of the run, especially during those deep midnight hours when the world feels like it belongs to just me, and the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead. My Peterbilt 379 hums along at a steady 70, her chrome exhaust stacks catching occasional moonlight as we roll through the high desert of New Mexico. The CB radio crackles with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it's just the gentle rumble of 18 wheels on pavement and the soft whisper of wind across my windshield. I've been driving this route for nearly 15 years now, hauling everything from electronics to furniture between Phoenix and Denver, and I know every mile marker, every rest stop, every place where the cell towers get sparse and the radio stations start to fade into static. Tonight's cargo is a load of office furniture bound for Colorado Springs. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should make this run any different from the hundreds I've made before. But as I cruise past the exit for Grants, New Mexico, something changes in the atmosphere of my cab, something subtle that makes the hair on my arm stand up despite the warmth from my heater. The first sign that something isn't quite right comes when my usual country station starts cutting out earlier than normal. I reach for the radio dial, scanning through the familiar frequencies, looking for something clear to keep me company through the long night ahead. Static fills most of the spectrum, punctuated by faint voices speaking in Spanish from stations hundreds of miles south, their signals bouncing off the ionosphere in ways that make them sound ghostly and distant. I settle on what sounds like a talk radio show, the host's voice barely audible through the white noise, discussing something about local history and forgotten places. The highway stretches ahead in perfectly straight lines, my headlights carving through darkness so complete it feels solid, like driving through black velvet. Occasional tumbleweeds drift across the road like suburban ghosts, and far off to the north I can see the faint glow of lights from some small town, whose name I've never learned. The radio host's voice drifts in and out of clarity, talking about old mining camps and abandoned settlements, places where people once lived and worked and dreamed before the desert reclaimed them. His tone is hypnotic, almost melodic, and I find myself listening more carefully despite the poor reception. As I pass the 200-mile marker, something strange happens to the broadcast. The host's voice becomes clearer, as if I'm suddenly receiving a much stronger signal, but the content of what he's saying doesn't quite make sense anymore. He's talking about truckers now, specifically about truckers driving alone at night, about the isolation and the tricks that darkness can play on a tired mind. His words seem almost directed at me personally, describing scenarios that feel uncomfortably familiar, situations I've experienced myself during long solo runs across empty highways. The cab of my truck suddenly feels smaller, more enclosed, despite the fact that I've been comfortable in the same space for thousands of miles. I adjust my rearview mirror and glance at the sleeper compartment behind me, seeing nothing but shadows and the familiar outline of my sleeping bag and personal belongings. The radio host continues talking about solitude and perception, about how the mind creates its own company when left alone for too long, and his voice has taken on a quality that makes me want to change the station, but somehow I can't bring myself to reach for the dial. Mile after mile passes in this strange audio trance, with the host's voice becoming my only companion in the vast emptiness of the New Mexican night. I notice that I haven't seen another vehicle in over an hour. No headlights in my mirrors, no taillights ahead, just the endless highway and the steady rhythm of my engine, and the increasingly unsettling monologue coming from my speakers. The host begins describing specific details about nighttime driving, about the way headlights create tunnels of light in darkness, about the psychological effects of staring at white lines for hours at a time. Then, somewhere around the 220-mile marker, the host's voice becomes perfectly clear, as if he's sitting right beside me in the passenger seat, and he says something that makes my blood turn cold in my veins. He says my name. Not truckers in general, not drivers, but specifically Marcus, and he's talking about my route, my truck, even details about my cargo that no random radio host should possibly know. The rational part of my mind tries to explain this away, suggests that I'm more tired than I realized, that I'm hearing things that aren't really there. But his voice continues with intimate knowledge of my life that sends chills down my spine. I reach for the radio dial with a shaking hand, desperate to find another station, any other station, but as I turn the knob, the host's voice follows me across every frequency. No matter where I tune, He's there, talking about me, about my truck, about this specific night and this specific stretch of highway. He describes the contents of my lunch cooler, mentions the photograph of my daughter that I keep clipped to my sun visor, even refers to the small tear in the upholstery of my driver's seat that I've been meaning to repair for months. The desert landscape outside my windows begins to feel different, more menacing, as if the familiar terrain has somehow shifted while I've been focused on the radio. The mountains in the distance seem closer than they should be, their silhouettes sharper against the star-filled sky. I press harder on the accelerator, eager to reach the next town, the next truck stop, anywhere with lights and people and the comfortable normalcy of human activity. But the host's voice grows more intimate, more conversational, as if he knows about my increasing anxiety and finds it amusing. Then comes the moment that changes everything, the moment when the host stops talking about me in the third person and begins addressing me directly. His voice becomes almost friendly, like an old acquaintance striking up a conversation, and he asks how I'm enjoying the drive tonight. Comments on the perfect weather for trucking, mentions that he hopes I'm not feeling too lonely out here in the middle of nowhere. I grip the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white in the green glow of my dashboard lights, and I seriously consider pulling over. But something about the endless darkness outside makes staying in motion feel like the safer option. The host's conversation becomes increasingly personal, referencing memories from my childhood, mentioning people I haven't thought about in years, describing events from my past with impossible accuracy. He talks about my ex-wife, about the reasons our marriage ended, about my relationship with my teenage daughter, and my fears about being an absent father because of my career choice. His voice remains calm and friendly throughout, but there's something underneath it, something that suggests he knows much more than he's revealing, something that makes every word feel like a violation of my privacy. As I crest a small hill and see the lights of a truck stop about 5 miles ahead, the host's tone suddenly changes, becomes more urgent, more excited. He starts talking about games, about the kinds of games that people play to pass time during long journeys, about how much more interesting these games become when the stakes are raised. He suggests that we play a game together, him and me, something simple to help the remaining miles pass more quickly. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn off the radio entirely, I find myself listening, drawn in by a curiosity that's stronger than my fear. The game, he explains, is very simple. He'll give me directions and I have to follow them exactly. Nothing dangerous, nothing that will hurt me or anyone else, just small actions that will make our conversation more interactive, more engaging. His voice has become hypnotic again, persuasive. And when he asks me to tap the horn twice, I find myself doing it before I've consciously decided to comply. The sound echoes across the empty desert, and I hear him chuckle with satisfaction through the speakers. The truck stop grows larger in my windshield, its neon signs promising fuel and food and human contact. But the host instructs me not to stop, suggests that our game is just getting interesting, and that it would be a shame to interrupt it now. Against my better judgment, I find myself driving past the exit, watching the lights fade in my mirrors as I continue into the darkness beyond. The host's voice becomes warmer, more appreciative, praising my willingness to play along, and I realize with growing horror that I seem to have lost some measure of control over my own actions. The next instruction is to adjust my rearview mirror, angle it so that I can see more of the sleeper compartment behind me, and as I comply, the host's voice drops to a whisper. He tells me that the most interesting games are the ones where you discover things about yourself that you didn't know before, where you're forced to confront truths that you've been avoiding. The mirror reflects only shadows and darkness, the familiar contents of my sleeper area barely visible in the dim light. But something about the altered angle makes the space look different, deeper, as if the compartment has somehow expanded beyond its normal dimensions. The glass between worlds. For Marcus, the rain had been my only companion for the last 300 miles. drumming its relentless rhythm against the windshield of my Peterbilt as I made my way through the winding back roads of eastern Oregon. The interstate had been closed due to a multi-vehicle pileup, forcing me and dozens of other truckers onto these forgotten highways that snaked through timber country like arteries through a sleeping giant. My cargo of furniture bound for Seattle wasn't time-sensitive, but I preferred to keep moving rather than sit in some truck stop, counting hours until the main route reopened. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic dance, clearing away the October drizzle just long enough for me to catch glimpses of the dense forest pressing in on both sides of the narrow road. Douglas firs towered into the gray sky, their branches heavy with moisture that seemed to absorb what little light the overcast afternoon provided. My headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the yellow center line that had become my guide through this maze of rural routes. It was sometime after 4 o'clock when I first noticed something odd about my windshield. The defroster had been working overtime against the humidity, and I'd been adjusting the vents when I caught sight of what looked like a smudge or crack in the glass. I squinted through the rain trying to focus on the spot, but the wipers swept across it before I could get a clear look. Maybe it was just road grime or a chip from a stone kicked up by another vehicle. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up fragments of distant conversations between truckers on channels that faded in and out, like whispers in the wind. I'd given up trying to find a clear station and let the white noise fill the cab, mixing with the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the persistent patter of rain. There's something almost meditative about driving in conditions like these, when the world shrinks down to just the road ahead and the steady rhythm of the truck eating up miles. That's when I saw it again, that strange distortion in the windshield. This time, the wipers had just cleared the glass, giving me a moment of clarity before the rain began to beat up again. It wasn't a crack or a smudge at all. It looked almost like an image was embedded in the glass itself, translucent and shifting, visible only when the light hit it just right. I rubbed my eyes, thinking fatigue might be playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the image was still there. It appeared to be some kind of landscape, overlaid on the view of the forest road ahead. I could make out what looked like rolling hills dotted with small vertical shapes that reminded me of fence posts or markers of some kind. The image was faint, like looking at a photograph printed on glass, and it seemed to shimmer and move independently of the real world beyond the windshield. I reached up to touch the glass from the inside, wondering if something had gotten between the layers of the safety glass, but my fingers found only smooth, solid surface. The sight was so unusual that I almost missed the deer that bounded across the road just ahead of my front bumper. I hit the brakes gently, feeling the air brakes hiss as the truck slowed, and watched the animal disappear into the forest on the other side. My heart rate picked up from the near miss, and I tried to refocus on the task of driving, but my eyes kept drifting back to that strange image in the windshield. As the afternoon light continued to fade, the image seemed to become more pronounced, as if it needed the dimness to fully manifest. What I had first taken for fence posts were clearly something else entirely. They were uniform in size and spacing, arranged in neat rows across the ghostly landscape that appeared superimposed over the Oregon forest. The realization crept over me slowly, like cold water seeping through a crack. They were headstones. I was looking at a graveyard projected somehow onto my windshield. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the road, a small gravel turnout barely large enough for my rig. The engine idled with its familiar rumble as I sat staring at the windshield, rain still pattering against the glass. The cemetery was clearly visible now, its rows of markers stretching across rolling terrain that bore no resemblance to the mountainous forest surrounding me. Some of the headstones were tall and elaborate, others simple rectangular slabs. In the distance of this phantom landscape, I could make out what appeared to be a small chapel or mausoleum, its Gothic outline dark against a sky that seemed perpetually overcast. I tried adjusting the defroster, thinking maybe it was some kind of condensation pattern, but the image remained unchanged. I even got out of the truck and examined the windshield from the outside, walking around to look at it from different angles while the rain soaked through my flannel shirt. From the outside, the glass appeared perfectly normal, with no unusual markings or distortions visible. But when I climbed back into the cab, the graveyard was still there, as clear as if someone had painted it on the inside surface of the glass. The strangest thing was how detailed the image appeared to be. I could make out individual names and dates on some of the closer headstones, though the text seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on it directly. The grass between the graves looked recently maintained, as if this were an active cemetery rather than some ancient burial ground. And there were flowers on some of the graves, bright splashes of color that seemed almost too vivid against the muted grays and greens of the phantom landscape. As I sat there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, movement caught my eye within the graveyard scene. A figure was walking slowly between the rows of headstones, following what appeared to be a gravel path. The person looked small and distant, dressed in dark clothing that made it difficult to distinguish any details. They moved with the unhurried pace of someone taking a leisurely stroll, pausing occasionally to examine particular graves before continuing on their way. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched the figure navigate the cemetery paths. This wasn't just a static image projected on my windshield somehow. It was like looking through a window into another place, another world where people went about their business among the dead. The figure paused near what appeared to be a large monument in the center of the graveyard, then turned and began walking in a new direction, heading toward a section where the headstones seemed newer and more elaborate. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the rain and the particular angle of the light. Maybe the windshield had been replaced at some point with glass that had unusual properties. Or maybe I was more tired than I'd realized and was experiencing some kind of hallucination. But the image was too clear, too detailed, too consistent to be dismissed as a trick of the light or a product of fatigue. As I watched, more figures began to appear in the cemetery. They emerged from behind monuments and mausoleums, walking the path between graves with that same unhurried pace. Some carried flowers, others simply wandered among the headstones as if visiting old friends. They all seemed to belong in this place, moving with familiarity through the landscape of the dead. And then one of them did something that sent ice through my veins. The figure nearest to what I perceived as the front of the cemetery, closest to where I sat watching, stopped walking and turned to face in my direction. Even across the distance of the phantom graveyard, I could feel the weight of their gaze. They stood perfectly still for a long moment, as if studying something they could see but couldn't quite identify. Then they raised one arm and pointed directly at me. The other figures in the cemetery stopped their wandering and turned to follow the direction of that pointing finger. One by one, they all oriented themselves toward me, standing motionless among the headstones like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool air in the cab, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. That's when I noticed that the graveyard was getting closer. What had started as a distant view was now filling more of the windshield, as if I were somehow approaching it or it were approaching me. I could make out more detail on the headstones now, could see the weathering on the stone monuments and the individual blades of grass on the graves. The figures standing among the markers were clearer too, and I realized with growing horror that their faces were turned up toward me, with expressions of anticipation, as if they'd been waiting for me to arrive. I threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the road, my hands shaking as I worked the shifter. The graveyard image remained fixed on the windshield, but as I accelerated, it seemed to recede slightly, returning to its previous distance. The figures continued to watch, their dark forms scattered among the headstones like sentinels. The Midnight Smile, from Jake Morrison. The chrome bumper of my Peterbilt caught the amber glow of the diner's neon sign as I pulled into the gravel lot. my 18 wheels crunching over loose stones that had been baking in the desert heat all day. It was well past 2 in the morning, and I'd been pushing hard across Nevada's endless stretches of highway, the kind of driving that makes your spine feel like a twisted coat hanger, and your eyes burn from staring at the yellow lines that seem to hypnotize you into a trance. The sign read Mel's Place in cheerful red letters, with a cartoon chef's face winking beside it, the kind of roadside hospitality that truckers like me depend on when the world feels empty except for the rumble of diesel engines and the whisper of wind across the sagebrush. Killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, feeling the truck settle beneath me like a tired horse finally allowed to rest. The diner looked exactly like 1,000 others I'd stopped at over my 15 years on the road. All white siding and large windows glowing with warm yellow light, promising coffee that could wake the dead and pie that might make you forget you'd been driving for 12 hours straight. Through those windows I could see the familiar shapes of booth seats and a counter with red vinyl stools, though the place seemed oddly empty for a truck stop on a major interstate route. Usually these places drew night owls like moths to flame, insomniacs and shift workers and drivers like me who lived in the space between sunset and sunrise. The heat hit me like opening an oven door when I climbed down from the cab, my boots hitting the gravel with a satisfying crunch. Even at this hour, the desert air shimmered with residual warmth, carrying scents of creosote and dust and something else underneath. Something sweet and organic that I couldn't quite place. The diner's air conditioning unit hummed steadily beside the building, a comforting mechanical sound that promised relief from the oppressive temperature. Above me, the stars stretched across the Nevada sky like scattered diamonds on black velvet, so bright and numerous they almost seemed fake, like a picture postcard of what the night sky should look like. The bell above the door chimed pleasantly as I stepped inside, and immediately I felt the blessed coolness of refrigerated air washing over my sweat-dampened shirt. The interior was exactly what I'd expected from the outside, all red vinyl and chrome fixtures and black and white checkered floor tiles that had probably been installed sometime in the 50s and maintained with the kind of care that spoke of pride in simple things. The jukebox in the corner played something soft and instrumental, the kind of music that fills silence without demanding attention. But what struck me immediately was not what I saw, but what I felt. A sensation like walking into a surprise party, where everyone is hiding just out of sight, holding their breath and waiting for the perfect moment to jump out and shout. The waitress emerged from behind the counter with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. The kind of genuine warmth that you rarely encounter in places where people are just passing through. She was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent finding joy in small moments. Her name tag read Dolores in faded letters, and she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been serving coffee and conversation to travelers for most of her adult life. Everything about her seemed perfectly normal, perfectly welcoming except for her smile, which was just a fraction too wide, showing perhaps one too many teeth, though in the diner's warm lighting it was difficult to be certain. "Welcome to Mel's Place, honey," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent years talking over the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine. "You're out late tonight or early, depending on how you look at it." "Coffee to start?" I nodded and took a seat at the counter, grateful for the chance to stretch my legs and feel like a human being instead of just another piece of machinery keeping the truck moving down the highway. She poured the coffee with practiced precision, the steam rising from the cup in lazy spirals that seemed to dance in the fluorescent light. The first sip was perfect, strong enough to wake the dead but smooth enough to drink without wincing. Exactly what my tired body needed. "Quiet night," I observed, gesturing toward the empty booths and silent dining room. Usually truck stops were social places where drivers shared stories and complaints about dispatchers and traffic. But tonight the diner felt isolated, cut off from the world beyond its windows like a ship floating in an ocean of darkness. Dolores nodded and refilled my cup without being asked, her movements smooth and automatic, though I noticed she never stopped smiling that slightly too wide smile. Never let her lips settle into a neutral expression even for a moment. "Oh, we get plenty of visitors," she said, and something in her tone made me look up from my coffee, though her expression remained pleasantly unchanged. "Folks stop by all hours of the night, coming from all directions, heading to all sorts of places. Some stay longer than others." She gestured toward the walls, and for the first time I really looked at the decorations that I had dismissed as typical diner memorabilia. Photographs covered nearly every available surface, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all showing people sitting in these very booths, standing beside trucks in the parking lot, gathered around the counter with coffee cups raised in casual toasts. But as my eyes adjusted to the diner's lighting, and I studied the photographs more carefully, I began to notice something unusual about them. Every single person in every single photograph was smiling. Not the casual half smiles or tired expressions you might expect from roadside snapshots, but broad, enthusiastic grins that seemed to stretch their faces beyond natural limits. Their eyes were wide and bright, almost glowing in the camera flash. And there was something uniform about their expressions, as if they had all been coached to arrange their features in exactly the same way. "Quite a collection," I said, trying to keep my voice casual while a cold feeling began to spread through my chest despite the diner's warm air. Dolores followed my gaze to the photographs, and her own smile seemed to grow even wider, if such a thing were possible, revealing teeth that gleamed white under the fluorescent lights. "We like to remember our guests," she explained, moving behind the counter with that same smooth efficiency, never taking her eyes off me for more than a few seconds at a time. "Truckers especially, they're the backbone of America, don't you think? Always moving, always traveling, bringing goods from one place to another. It's important work." The coffee suddenly tasted bitter in my mouth, and I found myself studying Dolores more carefully, noticing details that had escaped me in my initial relief at finding a welcoming place to rest. Her movements were perhaps too smooth, too practiced, like an actor who had performed the same role so many times that every gesture had become mechanical. Her eyes never seemed to blink, and when I looked closely I could see that her smile never wavered, never shifted or changed, as if it had been painted on her face and left to dry. The photographs on the walls seemed to watch me with their hundreds of identical grins, and I began to notice that many of the trucks visible in the background looked older than they should. Classic models from decades past mixed with more recent vehicles in a way that suggested this collection had been growing for a very long time. "How long has this place been open?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Dolores tilted her head slightly, her smile never changing, and for a moment she seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear, some distant sound or voice that required her complete attention. "Oh, we've been serving travelers for as long as anyone can remember," she said finally, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that made my skin crawl. "Time moves differently out here in the desert, don't you think? Days blend into nights, nights blend into days, and after a while it all becomes one long, continuous moment of hospitality and service." I set down my coffee cup with hands that had begun to shake slightly, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. Something was wrong here, fundamentally and deeply wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. The photographs continued to grin down at me from the walls, and I began to notice that some of them showed the same people at different times, aging backwards as my eyes moved from newer pictures to older ones, as if they had been visiting this place regularly for years or decades, growing younger instead of older with each visit. "I should probably get back on the road," I said, reaching for my wallet, but Dolores shook her head and held up a hand to stop me. "Oh, but you just got here," she protested, and for the first time since I had entered the diner, her smile seemed to flicker slightly, revealing something underneath that I didn't want to examine too closely. The Gregorian Mile. From Marcus Henley, the thing about driving freight cross-country for 23 years is that you develop a sixth sense about which loads are going to give you trouble. Sometimes it's the shipper who won't meet your eyes when they hand over the paperwork. Sometimes it's a delivery address that doesn't quite exist on any map you can find. And sometimes, like with the load I picked up outside Sacramento on that fog-thick October evening, it's the way the trailer seems to hum even when your engine's turned off. I should have known better when the dispatcher called it a rush job with premium pay. Emergency freight to a monastery outside Flagstaff, Arizona, she said. Religious artifacts that needed special handling. The kind of cargo that pays double because nobody else wants to touch it. I'd hauled stranger things in my Peterbilt over the years. Medical specimens that required refrigeration, government equipment with armed escorts, even a circus elephant once. But there was something in Denise's voice that night, a tremor she tried to hide behind her usual brisk professionalism, that made me wonder what I was getting myself into. The shipper's warehouse sat in an industrial district where the streetlights flickered more than they shone, casting nervous shadows across cracked asphalt. The building itself looked abandoned, its windows dark except for a single fluorescent tube that buzzed and sputtered near the loading dock. When I backed my trailer up to the bay, the hydraulic whine seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. Even the usual city sounds, the distant hum of traffic and the occasional airplane overhead, felt muted here, as if the fog had swallowed them whole. The warehouse foreman, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and hands that shook slightly when he signed the bills of lading, barely spoke during the loading process. I watched through my mirrors as workers wheeled out crate after crate, each one roughly the size of a coffin and wrapped in what looked like old canvas. They moved with unusual care, setting each piece down gently before sliding it into position. No power tools, no rough handling. Just the soft whisper of crates sliding across the trailer floor and the occasional murmur of voices speaking in what sounded like Latin. When the foreman handed me the sealed paperwork, his fingers brushed mine briefly, and I noticed they were ice cold despite the warmth of the evening. He leaned close to my open window, his breath carrying the strange scent of frankincense and old leather. "Drive straight through if you can manage it," he said quietly. "Don't stop longer than necessary, and whatever you do, don't open the trailer doors until you reach the monastery. Brother Augustine will be waiting for you." I wanted to ask what was in those crates that required such careful handling, but something in the man's hollow eyes discouraged questions. Instead, I secured my load, checked my tie-downs twice, and pulled out of the warehouse district as the fog began to thicken around my headlights. The city fell away behind me as I merged onto Interstate 80, the familiar weight of a full trailer settling over my truck like a comfortable blanket. For the first 100 miles, everything seemed normal. The Peterbilt's diesel engine maintained its steady rhythm. The CB radio crackled with occasional chatter from other drivers, and my trailer tracked straight and true behind me. I had NPR playing softly on the radio, something about archaeological discoveries in Rome. When I first noticed the sound coming from the sleeper berth behind me, it started as a low humming, so subtle I almost mistook it for engine vibration. But as I turned down the radio and listened more carefully, I realized it was something else entirely. A melodic drone that seemed to rise and fall in complex harmonies, like voices singing in perfect unison. The sound was muffled as if coming from very far away, but it had a haunting beauty that made the hair on my arm stand up. I pulled into a truck stop near Reno to fuel up and check my load, telling myself the singing was just my imagination, or maybe audio bleeding through from another CB channel. But when I walked around to the back of my trailer and pressed my ear against the rear doors, the sound was unmistakable. Voices, dozens of them, singing in what I was now certain was Latin. The melody was ancient and mournful, rising and falling like ocean waves, and it seemed to come from inside the trailer itself. My hands trembled slightly as I checked the seal on the doors, but it remained intact, just as the warehouse foreman had sealed it hours earlier. The trailer's refrigeration unit wasn't running. This wasn't a temperature-controlled load, but the metal felt strangely warm against my palm. I circled the entire trailer, looking for speakers or some kind of audio equipment that might explain the singing. but found nothing except the standard running lights and electrical connections. Back in the cab, I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the singing continued, growing gradually louder as the miles passed. The voices seemed to know I was listening now, and the harmonies became more complex, more urgent. Sometimes I caught fragments of words, Kyrie Ellison and Ave Maria, phrases I remembered from childhood visits to my grandmother's Catholic church. But there were other words too, older-sounding Latin that seemed to carry weight and meaning beyond my understanding. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, as my headlights cut through the darkness and the singing reached a crescendo that made my cab vibrate slightly, I began to understand that this wasn't a recording or some kind of supernatural phenomenon. The crates in my trailer weren't carrying artifacts at all. They were carrying something much more valuable and much more dangerous. I was hauling the preserved voices of monks, centuries of devotional singing somehow captured and contained, being transported to a new home where they could continue their eternal praise. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt an odd sense of peace settling over my shoulders. The singing was beautiful in a way that transcended the physical world, and I found myself driving in perfect rhythm with the melodies flowing from my trailer. My speedometer held steady at exactly 65 miles per hour. My steering wheel required almost no correction to keep the truck centered in its lane, and the usual aches and pains from long-distance driving simply vanished. Hours passed like minutes as I drove through the Arizona night, the singing guiding me along highways I'd traveled countless times before. But now familiar landmarks looked different, touched by an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from my trailer. Desert plants cast shadows that looked like praying figures, and distant mountains resembled cathedral spires reaching toward heaven. As dawn broke over the painted desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I saw the monastery perched on a red rock cliff ahead. It was much larger than I'd expected, with buildings that looked far older than anything that should exist in Arizona. Bell towers rose against the morning sky, and I could see robed figures moving through courtyards that seemed to shimmer in the early light. Brother Augustine was indeed waiting for me at the monastery's loading dock, a tall man with kind eyes and hands that radiated the same strange warmth I'd felt from the trailer. As my workers began unloading the crates with the same careful reverence I'd witnessed in Sacramento, the singing from my trailer grew softer, more peaceful, as if the voices knew they were finally home. "Thank you for bringing them safely," Brother Augustine said as he signed my delivery receipt. "They've been traveling for longer than you know, seeking a place where their devotion can continue undisturbed." I wanted to ask him about the singing, about what was really in those crates, but something in his serene expression told me that some questions were better left unasked. Instead, I climbed back into my cab and pulled away from the monastery, my empty trailer silent behind me for the first time in 800 miles. But even now, months later, on quiet nights when I'm driving through remote stretches of highway, I sometimes hear echoes of that ancient singing drifting through my cab. And I find myself wondering if those voices are still out there somewhere, traveling the dark roads in search of souls willing to carry their eternal song to places where faith still has meaning. The dispatcher hasn't called with any more special loads from that Sacramento warehouse, and part of me isn't sure whether I'm relieved or disappointed. The voice that answers back. From Marcus, the CB radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47, same as it had every night for the past week. Static filled my cab, mixing with the steady drone of the diesel engine as I pushed my Peterbilt through the endless stretch of Nevada highway that seemed to swallow headlights whole. The sound was familiar now, almost comforting in its predictability, though comfort wasn't quite the right word for what I felt when that transmission cut through the darkness. I'd been running this route between Reno and Salt Lake City for 3 years, hauling electronics and auto parts across the desert emptiness where the only company came through the radio waves. Most nights the CB stayed quiet except for the occasional trucker checking in, or the distant chatter from drivers still hours away. But this week had been different. This week, something had been trying to talk back. The first time it happened, I thought nothing of it. I'd keyed up to check for any drivers ahead near the Winnemucca exit, asking about road conditions with a casual Breaker 19. This is eastbound Marcus looking for a southbound report on the conditions ahead. And after a moment of static, a voice had responded with perfect timing. Not answering my question exactly, but responding to the rhythm of my transmission with a series of measured knocks that came through so clearly they might have been tapped directly on my speaker. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I assumed it was interference from some distant station. Maybe a repeater picking up Morse code or some amateur radio operator testing equipment. The desert played tricks with radio waves, bouncing signals off the ionosphere in strange ways that could make voices from hundreds of miles away sound like they were coming from the truck beside you. I'd keyed up again to clarify, but the knocking had stopped, replaced by the usual static and the distant hum of my own engine. The second night, I'd been more deliberate. Same stretch of highway, same time. And when I'd made my routine traffic check, the knocks had come again. But this time I'd counted them carefully. 9 knocks in groups of 3 with precise pauses between each group. When I'd released my key and tried again a few minutes later, the pattern had changed. 6 knocks, then silence. By the 4th night, I'd started to suspect the knocks were responding to something specific. I'd made my usual call, got the usual knocking response, then tried an experiment. Instead of my standard traffic check, I'd simply keyed up and knocked twice on my microphone. The response had been immediate. 2 knocks back, clear as crystal through the static. Tonight was the 7th night, and I found myself approaching that familiar stretch of highway with a mixture of anticipation and unease that made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The dashboard lights cast everything in pale green shadows, and the CB's channel selector glowed like a tiny beacon in the darkness. I'd been thinking about this all day during my mandatory rest period, trying to rationalize what was happening with explanations that made sense in daylight, but seemed thin and inadequate now that I was back in the desert dark. The mile markers counted down as they always did, and when I reached the spot where it usually happened, I slowed slightly and reached for the CB handset. The plastic was warm in my palm, worn smooth by years of use, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I brought it to my lips. Instead of my usual traffic call, I decided to be direct. Breaker Channel 19, this is eastbound Marcus. If there's anyone out there who's been knocking, I'd like to know who you are. The static seemed to intensify for a moment, then fade to an expectant silence. I waited, counting the seconds, and at exactly the 30-second mark, the knocking began. But this time it wasn't the simple patterns I'd grown accustomed to. This time, the knocks came in a complex rhythm that sounded almost like language, like someone tapping out words in a code I couldn't quite decipher. I grabbed a pen from my visor and started marking the pattern on a napkin, trying to capture the rhythm and timing. Long pause, 3 quick knocks, short pause, 2 knocks, long pause, 5 knocks. The pattern repeated twice more before falling silent, and when I played it back in my head, it had the cadence of someone speaking, as if the knocks were syllables in some strange conversation. "I hear you knocking," I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." The response was immediate. A single sharp knock followed by silence. Then faintly, barely audible through the static, I heard something that made my blood slow in my veins. It was my own voice, played back with perfect clarity. "But I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." I nearly dropped the handset. The playback had captured not just my words, but every subtle inflection, every breath, as if someone had recorded my transmission and immediately broadcast it back. I fumbled with the channel selector, scanning up and down the frequencies, but found only empty static on the neighboring channels. Whatever was responding to me was locked onto channel 19, the main trucker frequency, with precision that suggested intimate familiarity with CB protocols. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Are you another driver?" The knocking resumed, but now it was accompanied by something else. Behind the rhythmic tapping, I could hear the faint sound of an engine, a diesel rumble that matched the rhythm of my own Peterbilt almost exactly. But there were no headlights in my mirrors, no running lights visible on the long, straight stretch of highway behind me, and I hadn't passed another truck in over an hour. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the speedometer climb as my truck gained momentum on the slight downgrade. The engine sound and the radio transmission matched my acceleration perfectly, staying in sync with my RPMs as if someone were monitoring my every move and adjusting their engine to mirror mine exactly. "This isn't funny anymore," I said into the handset, my voice sharper now. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested." This time, the response was my own voice again, but distorted slightly, as if played through a speaker with failing components. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not interested." The highway stretched ahead in an endless ribbon of asphalt, illuminated by my headlights for perhaps 200 yards before disappearing into absolute darkness. No moon tonight, just the vast canopy of desert stars that seemed too distant to provide any real light. I checked my GPS, confirming I was still on the right route, still making good time toward Salt Lake City, but something about the familiar landmarks seemed off. The mile markers were appearing more frequently than they should, and I could have sworn I'd passed the same distinctive formation of rocks twice in the last 10 minutes. I tried switching to channel 17, then channel 21, but the knocking followed me to each frequency, always beginning exactly 30 seconds after I made a transmission. And now, between the knocks, I could hear other sounds: the whistle of wind through windows, the subtle squeak of springs in suspension that matched my truck's movements perfectly, even the distinctive whine of my turbocharger spooling up on acceleration. It was as if someone were driving in perfect synchronization with me, matching every movement, every sound, every vibration of my truck, but remaining completely invisible. The thought sent chills down my spine, and I found myself checking the mirrors compulsively, scanning the darkness for any sign of lights or movement. "Where are you?" I whispered into the microphone, not really expecting an answer. The response came not as knocks this time, but as my own whispered words played back with perfect fidelity. "Where are you?" I threw the handset down and focused on driving, pushing the truck harder than I normally would on this stretch of highway. The speedometer crept toward 80, then 85, and still the engine sounds and the radio transmissions kept perfect pace. I tried turning off the CB entirely, but even with the power switch off, the knocking continued, now coming directly through the speaker as if the radio were still active. Then, impossibly, I began to hear my own CB transmissions played back from earlier in the week, my voice asking about road conditions, making routine traffic checks, even casual conversations with other drivers I'd encountered on previous runs. But these weren't recordings. They were live transmissions, broadcast in real time as if I were having conversations with myself across time. The exit for Battle Mountain appeared in my headlights, and I made a split-second decision to leave the interstate. I needed to get off this highway, to break whatever pattern had been established over the past week. I took the off-ramp faster than I should have, feeling the trailer sway slightly behind me as I navigated the curve. The convoy that never was. From Marcus, the thing about driving nights on Interstate 40 through New Mexico is that you get used to the emptiness, the way the desert stretches out like a black ocean under the stars, broken only by the occasional glow of distant truck stops or the pale wash of your headlights on asphalt. I've been running this route for 12 years now, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the country in my Peterbilt 379, and I thought I knew every mile of it, every rise and dip, every place where the wind cuts through the cab just wrong and makes that whistling sound that can drive a man half crazy if he lets it. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first saw them, those red lights floating in my mirrors like distant stars that had somehow fallen too low. The air had that crisp bite that comes before winter really sets in, and I had my windows cracked just enough to keep the diesel fumes from getting too thick in the cab. The radio was playing some old country song, the kind that tells stories about lonesome highways and drivers who never make it home. and the steady hum of my engine was keeping me company as I rolled through the darkness somewhere between Albuquerque and Amarillo. At first, I figured it was just another trucker running behind me, maybe a mile or two back. The way their tail lights sometimes seem to dance and shimmer in the side mirrors when the road gets wavy from heat, or when your eyes get tired from staring too long at the white lines. But these lights were different somehow, floating higher than they should have been, and they seemed to pulse with a rhythm that didn't match any truck I'd ever seen. They weren't the sharp, bright red of modern LED lights, either, but something softer, more like the glow of coals in a dying fire. I adjusted my mirrors, thinking maybe the vibration from the road had knocked them out of alignment, but the lights stayed right where they were, hovering in that middle distance where the darkness starts to play tricks on you. When I slowed down for a grade, they stayed the same distance behind me. When I sped up on a long, flat stretch where the speed limit jumps to 80, they kept perfect pace, never getting closer, never falling back, just floating there in the black like they were tethered to my truck by some invisible chain. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter. Drivers calling out speed traps and weather conditions, someone looking for directions to a truck stop with decent coffee, the kind of voices that make the highway feel less empty when it's just you and the night. I picked up the mic and keyed in, asking if anyone else could see the lights behind me, describing their position and that strange floating quality they had. The responses came back confused. Other drivers saying they couldn't see anything on my tail except darkness, asking if maybe I needed to pull over and get some rest. But the lights were there. I could see them clear as anything, and now they seemed to be getting just a little bit brighter, pulsing in a pattern that almost seemed intentional, like someone was trying to send a message in some code I couldn't understand. I pulled up my GPS and zoomed out, looking for any roads that might intersect with the interstate where those lights could be coming from. But there was nothing, just empty desert marked with elevation lines and the thin blue thread of the highway I was following. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar tune, 18 liters of diesel power that had carried me across 1,000,000 miles without ever letting me down. But now even that comfortable sound seemed different, like it was harmonizing with something I couldn't quite hear, some low frequency that was coming from somewhere behind me. I reached over and turned down the radio, and in the relative quiet I could swear I heard it, a distant rumble that sounded like another truck, but with a note to it that didn't quite match any diesel engine I knew. Miles passed under my wheels, the white lines on the asphalt flowing past like a river of paint, and still the lights followed, never wavering, never changing their distance. I tried changing lanes, moving from the right to the left and back again, but they stayed centered behind me, floating at that same impossible height. When I passed under an overpass, I looked up through my windshield, expecting to see them reflected on the concrete above. But there was nothing there except the dark span of the bridge disappearing into the night behind me. The desert around me was alive with small sounds that you only notice when you're really listening. The whisper of wind through scrub brush, the distant call of some night bird, the soft patter of insects hitting the windshield. But underneath it all was that low rumble that seemed to be getting closer. And when I looked in my mirrors again, the red lights had definitely moved, floating closer now, close enough that I should have been able to see the outline of whatever vehicle they were attached to, the bulk of a cab and trailer lit up by the splash of my own taillights. But there was nothing there except the lights themselves, pairs of them arranged like the markers on the back of a truck, but suspended in empty air, glowing with that soft red fire that seemed to pulse in time with my own heartbeat. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the Peterbilt surge forward with a growl of power. But the lights kept pace effortlessly, and now I could see more of them. A whole line of red dots stretching back into the darkness like a convoy of phantom trucks following in my wake. The CB radio erupted with static, a harsh burst of white noise that made me jump and reach for the volume knob. But underneath the static I could hear voices, faint and distorted, calling out in words I couldn't quite make out. They sounded like truck drivers, using the codes and language of the road, but there was something wrong with them. something hollow and distant, like voices echoing down a long tunnel or across a vast empty space. I tried calling out again, asking for anyone to confirm what I was seeing, but the static swallowed my words and spat them back at me, twisted and strange. The red lights were closer now, so close that they should have been illuminating the back of my trailer. But when I stuck my head out the window and looked back, I could see my own trailer clearly in the moonlight, and there was nothing behind it but empty road and those impossible lights floating in formation. The highway ahead curved gently to the right, following the contour of a low ridge, and as I took the turn, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the distance, maybe 5 miles ahead, was another set of lights, but these were the bright white headlights of trucks coming toward me. A whole convoy of them stretched across both lanes of the interstate. But that was impossible, because this was a divided highway, with a wide median strip separating the eastbound and westbound lanes, and those lights were definitely on my side of the road, bearing down on me like a freight train. I hit the brakes, feeling the weight of my load shift forward as the air brakes hissed and grabbed. But the white lights kept coming, and now I could hear the rumble of engines clearly, not just the phantom sound from behind me, but the real roar of diesel power approaching fast. The red lights in my mirrors pulsed brighter, and suddenly the CB radio cleared up, and I could hear voices calling out, warning of a wrong-way driver, telling everyone to get off the road using call signs and truck numbers that sounded familiar, but somehow old-fashioned, like something from decades ago. I pulled hard to the right, feeling the truck lean as I took the shoulder at speed, gravel flying up to ping against the undercarriage as the white lights roared past me in the left lane. And for just a moment I caught a glimpse of the first truck in the convoy, an old Kenworth with a high cab and chrome that gleamed in the moonlight. And behind the wheel I saw a driver who raised his hand in a wave as he passed, his face pale in the green light of his dashboard. The rest of the convoy followed, truck after truck rolling past in the lane I had just vacated, their engines thundering and their exhaust stacks shooting flames into the night sky. And I counted at least 20 of them before the last one disappeared around the curve ahead. My heart was pounding as I pulled back onto the pavement and checked my mirrors, half expecting to see the red lights still following me. But the road behind me was empty and dark. Nothing but the familiar glow of my own running lights reflected on the asphalt. I drove the rest of the night in silence. The radio turned off and my windows rolled up tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just missed being part of something. Some convoy that ran these highways on its own schedule, following routes that didn't appear on any map. When the sun came up over the Texas Panhandle, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, everything seemed normal again, just another morning on the long road home. But sometimes, when I'm running that stretch of I-40 late at night, and the darkness seems deeper than it should, I catch myself watching the mirrors, looking for those floating red lights that follow without sound or substance. The Gospel according to Goodyear. From Marcus Wheeler. The first time I heard my tires speaking in tongues, I was hauling a load of religious books from Nashville to Little Rock on a humid September night. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon, and the only sound should have been the familiar hum of my Peterbilt's engine and the rhythmic thrum of 18 wheels against asphalt. But somewhere between mile marker 127 and the next truck stop, I began to notice something else threading through the mechanical symphony of my rig. It started as a whisper, so soft I almost convinced myself it was just the wind catching the trailer at an odd angle. But as the miles rolled beneath me, the sound grew more distinct, more purposeful. It seemed to be coming from below, from the very wheels that carried me through the Arkansas darkness. At first, it sounded like static from a distant radio station, the kind of interference you get when you're driving through a valley and lose your signal. But this static had rhythm, cadence, almost like speech. I'd been driving truck for 23 years, ever since I graduated high school in Tupelo, and I thought I'd heard every sound a rig could make. The groan of settling cargo, the whistle of air through worn weather stripping, the ping of cooling metal after a hard climb through mountain passes. This was different. This was something I couldn't explain away with mechanical knowledge or experience. The night was thick with humidity, and my windshield kept fogging despite the air conditioning running full blast. The wipers squeaked occasionally as they cleared away the moisture that seemed to condense from nowhere, and their rhythm began to sync with whatever sound was rising from my wheels. Squeak whisper, like a call and response in some liturgy I didn't understand. I rolled down my window, thinking maybe I could isolate the sound, figure out which tire might be going bad. The warm Arkansas air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and distant rain. But instead of helping me identify a mechanical problem, opening the window only made the whispers clearer. They weren't random sounds after all. They were words, or at least something that wanted to be words, spoken in a language I'd never heard but somehow felt in my bones. The syllables rose and fell with an ancient rhythm, sometimes soft as prayer, sometimes urgent as warning. They seemed to come from all 18 wheels at once, a chorus of rubber and steel singing in perfect harmony. I found myself leaning forward, straining to catch individual words or phrases, but every time I thought I was close to understanding, the language would shift, become something else entirely. My CB radio crackled to static, then cleared. Breaker 19, this is Moondog eastbound at the 125. Any drivers hearing something strange tonight? Over. The voice was tight with confusion, maybe a little fear. I grabbed my handset. This is Bible Belt westbound. What kind of strange you talking about, Moondog? Can't rightly say Bible Belt. Sounds like my wheels are trying to tell me something, but I can't make heads or tails of it. You copy anything unusual? I hesitated, thumb hovering over the talk button. Admitting you were hearing voices was a good way to get a mandatory rest period and a visit with the company psychologist. But the relief in knowing I wasn't alone outweighed the risk. Copy that, Moondog. I got the same thing happening. Sounds almost like preaching, but in some foreign tongue. The radio stayed quiet for a long moment, then another voice joined in. This is Nighthawk southbound. Y'all picking up that revival meeting coming up from your tires too? Been listening to it for the last 50 miles. Within minutes, the CB was alive with drivers reporting the same phenomenon. Wheels speaking in unknown languages, rubber prophesying in tongues that felt familiar but remained incomprehensible. All of us hauling loads through the same stretch of Arkansas highway. All of us hearing our trucks trying to tell us something in voices that seemed older than the roads we traveled. I checked my load manifest again, running my flashlight over the paperwork. 3 pallets of Bibles, 2 pallets of hymnals, and 1 crate marked simply Revival Supplies, handle with reverence. The shipment was bound for the New Covenant Ministry in Little Rock, part of their upcoming tent revival. Nothing unusual about hauling religious materials, I'd done it dozens of times before. But something about this particular load felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't identify. The whispers from my wheels grew more insistent as I approached the next exit. The sounds began to layer and harmonize, creating something that resembled music. A hymn sung in a language that predated English, maybe predated any human language at all. I felt a strange compulsion to pull off at the exit, to find a quiet place where I could listen more carefully to what my truck was trying to tell me. The truck stop appeared like an oasis of neon and fluorescent light in the surrounding darkness. As I downshifted and felt my speed decrease, the volume of the whispers increased proportionally, as if my tires were desperate to deliver their message before I came to a stop. Other trucks were already parked in the lot, their drivers standing in small groups near the fuel islands, talking in low, urgent voices. I backed into a parking space and set my brakes, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they became clearer, more articulate. I could make out distinct voices now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking simultaneously in that impossible tongue. The sound seemed to rise from the asphalt itself, as if the very ground was trying to communicate. Walking toward the other drivers, I noticed that several of them were holding their cell phones toward their trucks, trying to record the phenomenon. But every phone screen I saw showed the same thing: audio levels registering 0, as if the whispers existed in a frequency only we could perceive. "Started about an hour ago," said a driver I recognized from previous runs, a middle-aged woman who hauled medical supplies. "Never heard anything like it. Sounds almost like glossolalia, you know, speaking in tongues like at those Pentecostal services." An older driver nodded grimly. "My grandmother used to do that back when I was a kid. Said it was the Holy Spirit working through her. But this?" He gestured toward our parked trucks. "This feels different, older, like something that was speaking in tongues before there were tongues to speak in." The whispers continued for another 20 minutes as we stood there, a congregation of confused truckers trying to understand why our vehicles had suddenly found religion. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, the voices faded. The parking lot fell silent except for the normal sounds of idling engines and distant highway traffic. I returned to my Peterbilt and fired up the engine, listening carefully as I pulled back onto the interstate. Nothing but the usual mechanical sounds. The CB radio was quiet too, as if the other drivers were afraid to acknowledge what we'd all experienced. Afraid that talking about it might make it start again. The rest of the drive to Little Rock passed without incident. I delivered my load to the New Covenant Ministry just as the sun was rising, painting the Arkansas sky in shades of gold and pink. The receiving dock was busy with volunteers preparing for the revival, setting up chairs and hanging banners that proclaimed the power of spiritual gifts. As the workers unloaded my trailer, I struck up a conversation with the minister, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and calloused hands. I mentioned the strange sounds during the night, describing them carefully, trying not to sound crazy. His expression grew serious as I spoke. "You're not the first driver to mention something like that," he said quietly. "We've been getting calls all morning. Seems like every truck carrying supplies for the revival experienced the same thing." He paused, looking out at the sunrise. "My grandfather always said that faith could move mountains, but maybe it can speak through wheels too. Maybe the Spirit finds a way to travel the roads, preparing the way for what's to come." I wanted to ask him more, but he was called away to handle other preparations. As I drove my empty truck out of Little Rock, I found myself wondering about the cargo I'd carried, about the power that some people believe can inhabit physical objects, transforming them into conduits for the divine or the mysterious. The drive home was quiet, my wheels speaking only the language of rubber against pavement. But sometimes, late at night when I'm hauling through that same stretch of Arkansas highway, I still listen carefully to the sounds beneath my truck. Because once you've heard your wheels speaking in tongues, you never quite trust the silence again. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can still hear whispers rising from the road, messages in a language older than words, carried by 18 wheels through the darkness toward destinations I may never understand. The Meridian Stop, from Jake Holloway. The CB radio had been crackling with warnings about the Meridian rest area for the better part of 3 hours as I pushed my Peterbilt through the endless Nebraska night. But exhaustion was making my eyelids feel like lead weights, and my decision-making abilities were starting to fray at the edges. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a harsh green 11:47, and I'd been driving since dawn with nothing but truck stop coffee and determination keeping me upright behind the wheel. The other drivers had been vague in their warnings, speaking in half sentences and nervous chuckles about how folks who stopped at Meridian sometimes took longer breaks than they planned. But fatigue has a way of making even the most superstitious trucker rationalize away the supernatural in favor of a few hours of blessed unconsciousness. The rest area appeared through my rain-streaked windshield like something emerging from a fever dream, its sodium vapor lights casting everything in a sickly orange glow that seemed to pulse with each sweep of my wipers across the glass. The sign reading Meridian Rest Area next right looked newer than it should have, considering the cracked and weathered asphalt that led to the exit ramp, and something about the perfectly maintained landscaping struck me as odd for a facility that seemed so isolated from the main highway. I could see perhaps a dozen vehicles scattered throughout the parking area, their shapes rendered ghostly and indistinct by the constant drizzle that had been following me across 3 states, and the sight of other travelers should have been reassuring, but instead filled me with a strange sense of unease I couldn't quite articulate. As my rig rolled to a stop near the far end of the lot, away from the cluster of cars and smaller trucks near the facilities building, I noticed how perfectly still everything appeared despite the number of vehicles present. No dome lights flickered on and off as travelers checked maps or counted remaining miles. No exhaust plumes rose from idling engines, and most unsettling of all, no figures moved between the vehicles and the restroom facilities that should have been the primary draw for stopping at such a place. The building itself was a typical highway rest stop construction, all beige brick and institutional efficiency, but the windows glowed with a warm yellow light that seemed somehow too inviting, too welcoming for a place that existed solely to serve the basic needs of highway travelers. The rain drummed against my cab with increasing intensity as I sat there studying the scene before me, my engine ticking as it cooled and settled, and I found myself reluctant to leave the familiar comfort of my driver's seat for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The CB radio continued its occasional chatter, but the voices seemed distant now, as if they were transmitting from much farther away than the handful of miles I'd traveled since last hearing clear communications. And when I tried to respond to a driver asking about road conditions ahead, my transmission seemed to disappear into static without acknowledgement. The sensation of being cut off from the larger world of the highway began to settle over me like a heavy blanket, and I realized that the usual sounds of distant traffic that should have been audible even from a rest area had faded to complete silence. My logbook demanded that I take a mandatory break, and the Department of Transportation regulations were unforgiving when it came to hours of service violations, so I gathered my jacket and decided to make the short walk to the facilities before settling in for what I hoped would be 4 hours of restorative sleep. The moment I stepped out of my cab, the quality of the silence struck me as profoundly wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of a rural rest stop, but rather the oppressive stillness of a place where sound itself seemed reluctant to exist. My footsteps echoed strangely on the wet asphalt, producing a hollow sound that seemed to carry much farther than it should have in the open air. And I noticed that the rain, while still visible in the amber circles cast by the overhead lights, had somehow stopped making any noise as it struck the ground around me. The other vehicles in the lot appeared to be in various states of long-term occupancy as I walked past them toward the main building, with personal items visible through windows that were fogged with condensation and a fine layer of dust on exterior surfaces that suggested they'd been stationary for much longer than a typical rest stop visit would require. A red sedan near the entrance had a child's stuffed animal pressed against the rear window, its button eyes seeming to track my movement as I passed, and a pickup truck with Missouri plates had camping gear visible in its bed that looked as though it had been arranged for a journey that had never resumed. The license plates I could make out represented states from across the country, suggesting that Meridian Rest Area drew travelers from all corners of the interstate highway system. Yet none of these vehicles showed any signs of recent departure or arrival. Inside the facilities building, fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the particular frequency that seems designed to induce headaches, and the air carried the scent of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with something else, something organic and slightly sweet that reminded me uncomfortably of flowers left too long in a vase. The restrooms were pristine to the point of being unsettling, with every surface gleaming under the harsh lighting and not a single paper towel or piece of litter to suggest recent human use. And when I tried the water at one of the sinks, it ran perfectly clear and cold but somehow felt wrong against my skin, as though it contained some mineral or chemical that left a strange tingling sensation long after I'd dried my hands. The vending machines along one wall were fully stocked with snacks and beverages, their colors bright and appealing under the fluorescent glare, but the coin mechanisms appeared to be sealed with some kind of clear tape, and small handwritten signs reading "Out of Order Management" were taped over each selection button. A bulletin board near the exit caught my attention as I prepared to return to my truck, and I found myself studying the collection of notices and advertisements that covered its cork surface, with growing confusion and alarm. Missing person flyers dominated the display, dozens of them overlapping and layered several deep, showing the faces of men, women, and children who had apparently vanished while traveling through the area over what appeared to be many years based on the varying degrees of weathering and fading the papers had undergone. The photographs smiled out at me with the confident expressions of people who had expected to reach their destination safely, and I noticed that many of the flyers included details about vehicles that matched those I'd observed in the parking lot outside, right down to license plate numbers and distinctive features like bumper stickers or custom modifications. My hands began to shake as I read description after description of travelers who had last been seen at or near the Meridian Rest area, and I realized that the dates on some of the older flyers stretched back more than a decade, suggesting that whatever was happening at this place had been going on for a very long time, without resolution or explanation. The newest addition to the collection appeared to be less than a month old, showing a family of 4 who had been traveling from California to visit relatives in Ohio, and their minivan was parked less than 50 yards from where I'd left my own truck. Its windows dark and its occupants nowhere to be seen. The realization that I was looking at what amounted to a memorial wall for people who had simply vanished without a trace sent ice water through my veins, and I began backing toward the door with my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The parking lot seemed different when I emerged from the building, though I couldn't immediately identify what had changed in the few minutes I'd spent inside studying the bulletin board of the missing. The arrangement of vehicles appeared subtly altered, as though some had moved closer to my truck while others had shifted position in ways that would have been impossible without drivers I had not seen, and the quality of light from the overhead fixtures had taken on a more golden hue that made everything appear as though it were being viewed through amber glass. My Peterbilt sat exactly where I'd left it, but something about its silhouette, against the artificial twilight created by the rest area's lighting, made it appear smaller and more vulnerable than the massive machine I'd been piloting across the country for the past 15 years, and I realized that my hands were trembling as I reached for the door handle. The engine turned over immediately when I turned the key, filling me with a relief so profound that I almost sobbed with gratitude. But as I prepared to put the transmission in drive and leave this increasingly unsettling place behind, I noticed that my fuel gauge was reading nearly empty, despite having filled up less than 200 miles ago. The mathematics of diesel consumption made no sense given the distance I'd traveled and the driving conditions I'd encountered, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd had more than enough fuel to reach my destination without another stop. Yet the needle hovered just above the red zone that would leave me stranded on the highway within a few dozen miles. The nearest truck stop with diesel fuel was more than 60 miles ahead according to my atlas, and the growing certainty that this discrepancy was not accidental filled me with a cold dread that seemed to emanate. The Cargo That Wept, from Jake Morrison. The humidity hit me like a slap the moment I stepped out of my Peterbilt at the loading dock in Biloxi. August in Mississippi is no joke, but I've been running freight through the Gulf Coast for 15 years, and you learn to deal with the sticky air that clings to your skin like a second layer of clothing. The dispatcher had been vague about the cargo, just said it was a priority shipment heading to a research facility in North Carolina. Something about marine biology specimens that needed to stay at a specific temperature. The pay was double my usual rate, so I didn't ask too many questions. The loading crew worked in unusual silence, their movements deliberate and careful as they wheeled out 12 identical containers, each about the size of a coffin but cylindrical, made of brushed steel with multiple temperature gauges and what looked like small viewing ports sealed with thick glass. The foreman, a weathered man with salt and pepper whiskers, handed me the manifest and shipping papers with hands that trembled slightly. His eyes never quite met mine when he explained that the cargo needed to maintain a constant 68 degrees, and that under no circumstances should I open or attempt to inspect the containers. As they secured the last container in my trailer, I noticed something odd. Despite the oppressive heat of the Mississippi evening, condensation was already forming on the outside of each cylinder, tiny droplets that caught the amber glow of the loading dock lights. The foreman must have seen me staring because he cleared his throat and mentioned that the refrigeration units were very efficient, sometimes too efficient, and that a little moisture was normal. But there was something in his voice, a nervous edge that made me wonder what exactly I was hauling. The first few hours of the drive were routine enough. Interstate 10 stretched ahead of me through the darkness, my headlights cutting through the thick air that shimmered with heat mirages even at midnight. The radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, complaints about construction delays and smoky reports about cheap truck stop coffee. My trailer felt heavier than it should have for what was supposedly scientific equipment, and every time I took a curve I could hear a subtle sloshing sound from behind me, like liquid moving in containers that were supposed to be sealed. Around 2 in the morning, somewhere between Mobile and Montgomery, I pulled into a rest stop to check my load and grab some coffee. The parking area was nearly empty except for a couple of other rigs and a lone RV with Alabama plates. As I walked around to inspect my trailer, the smell hit me, a briny organic odor that reminded me of tide pools and seaweed, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. The condensation on the containers had increased dramatically, and now small puddles were forming on the trailer floor beneath each cylinder. I called the emergency number on my shipping papers, but it went straight to voicemail. The recorded message was brief and professional, asking me to leave my name and continue with the delivery as scheduled. But as I stood there in the humid night air, I could swear I heard something from inside the containers, a rhythmic sound like breathing or waves lapping against a shore. The viewing ports were fogged over with moisture, making it impossible to see inside, but occasionally a shadow seemed to move behind the glass. Getting back on the road, I tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of the engine and the white lines disappearing under my wheels, but the smell was getting stronger, seeping into the cab through the air conditioning vents. It was definitely oceanic now, but with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The sloshing sounds from the trailer were becoming more pronounced, especially when I braked or turned, and I began to wonder if one of the containers had sprung a leak. By 4 in the morning, I was climbing through the hill country of northern Alabama when the real strangeness began. The condensation wasn't just forming on the containers anymore. It was running like tears down the inside walls of my trailer, creating small streams that pooled and swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. When I stopped at a way station, the inspector took one look at the puddles forming beneath my trailer and waved me through quickly, his face pale in the fluorescent lights. The mountain roads of eastern Tennessee brought a welcome coolness to the air, but the cargo seemed unaffected by the temperature change. If anything, the moisture was increasing, and now I could see actual droplets falling from the trailer's ceiling through my mirrors. The viewing ports on the containers had cleared somewhat, and in the brief moments when my headlights swept across them, I thought I glimpsed movement inside. Something that flowed and shifted like liquid but seemed to have purpose, intention. Dawn was breaking over the Blue Ridge Mountains when I made my scheduled stop at a truck stop outside Knoxville. The parking lot was busy with the morning rush, drivers grabbing breakfast and fuel before hitting the road. But as I pulled into a space, other truckers began pointing at my trailer and backing away. The condensation had become a steady drip, creating a small lake beneath my rig, and the smell had intensified to the point where it was making people gag and cover their faces. I tried calling the emergency number again, and this time someone answered, a woman with a crisp, professional voice who seemed unsurprised by my report of excessive moisture. She assured me that everything was normal, that the specimen sometimes produced excess humidity during transport, and that I should continue to the delivery point without delay. But when I asked what exactly I was carrying, there was a long pause before she said it was classified research material and hung up. The final leg of the journey took me through the mountains of North Carolina, winding roads that hugged steep hillsides and crossed rushing streams. The cargo had become increasingly active, the sloshing sounds now accompanied by what I could only describe as a tapping or knocking from inside the containers. The moisture had reached the point where it was actually flowing out of the trailer, leaving a wet trail on the asphalt behind me like breadcrumbs in a dark fairy tale. As I descended toward the research facility, hidden in a remote valley surrounded by dense forest, I noticed that the trees along the road were unusually lush and green, as if they had been receiving far more water than normal. The facility itself was a collection of low, modern buildings behind high fences, with security checkpoints and cameras that tracked my approach. The guards who met me at the gate were wearing what looked like hazmat suits, and they directed me to a loading dock that was completely enclosed and sealed off from the outside air. The unloading process was swift and efficient, with workers in full protective gear, using specialized equipment to transfer the containers. But as they moved the last cylinder, something went wrong, and it tilted at an angle that caused fluid to spray from one of the viewing ports. The liquid was clear but viscous, and where it hit the concrete floor, it seemed to move on its own, flowing in spirals and patterns that defied gravity. The workers immediately hosed down the area with some kind of neutralizing solution, but not before I saw small tendrils of the fluid reaching toward a storm drain. The facility supervisor, a nervous man in wire-rimmed glasses, handed me my payment and a document to sign, but his hands were shaking as he explained that I was never to discuss the nature of this cargo or the delivery location. As I prepared to leave, driving my now empty trailer back through the mountain roads, I thought the worst was over. But looking in my mirrors, I could see that the trees along the route were already showing signs of change, their leaves growing darker and more vibrant, as if something in the moisture from my cargo had given them unearthly life. Even now, weeks later, I still wake up sometimes thinking I can smell that briny, organic odor, and when it rains, I find myself wondering what happened to all that fluid that dripped from my trailer across 3 states. The money was good, too good really, but I've turned down every job offer that's come from that same dispatcher since then. Because sometimes, when I'm driving through areas where the vegetation seems just a little too green, a little too alive, I remember the sound of that cargo weeping its way across the country, and I wonder what we've already let loose into the world.